The oppressive scent of beeswax, old money, and seared steak clung to the velvet drapes of the Gilded Lantern, a scent Clara May Thompson knew better than the lavender soap in her own bathroom. For a 20-year-old art history student juggling 2 jobs, it was the smell of survival. It was the scent of the 4:30 a.m. alarm, of checking her grandmother's medication before dawn, of the hour-long bus ride into the city's historic heart, a journey that felt like traveling to another century. The Gilded Lantern wasn't just a restaurant, it was an institution, a relic of a bygone era where mahogany walls absorbed the hushed secrets of senators and stockbrokers. It prided itself on impeccable tradition and ruthless standards. Every silver fork was polished to a mirror shine, every wine glass was held by the stem, and every employee was expected to be an unobtrusive ghost, anticipating needs before they were spoken. The master of this gilded cage was Julian Croft, the general manager. He was a man sculpted from ambition and disdain, with a smile as thin and sharp as a boning knife. His posture was ramrod straight, his suits were impeccably tailored, and his eyes, the color of faded currency, missed nothing. A single fingerprint on a water goblet was not a mistake to Julian. It was a personal affront, a crack in the perfect facade he meticulously maintained. He saw his staff not as people, but as components in a machine, easily replaced if they showed the slightest sign of wear or malfunction. Clara was a good component. She was swift, silent, and had perfected the art of the deferential gaze, a mask of placid servitude that concealed the frantic calculations of tuition fees, her grandmother's mounting medical bills, and the ever-present fear of a single unexpected expense collapsing their fragile world. She moved through the dinner service like a phantom, her steps soundless on the plush Persian rugs, her memory flawless. She knew which patrons preferred their water with no ice, which senator's mistress was allergic to shellfish, and which judge tipped generously only when his wife wasn't looking. For the past several months, an old man had become a quiet fixture in the restaurant's less desirable corner, a small table near the service entrance that was usually reserved for walk-ins or overflows. He would appear on Tuesday and Thursday evenings, just as the main dinner rush began to swell. He never made a reservation. He was a whisper of a man, with a frame that seemed too delicate for the world and a shock of unruly white hair that defied gravity. He wore the same tweed blazer on every visit, a garment that had once been magnificent but was now frayed at the cuffs and shiny at the elbows. The only hint of former prosperity was in his shoes, worn leather brogues that were scuffed but immaculately polished, their soles worn thin as paper. He would sit for 2 hours, ordering only a pot of hot water with lemon, which he sipped with a slow, deliberate grace. He never read, never used a phone. He simply watched, his pale, intelligent eyes taking in the theater of the dining room. The other servers, following Julian's unspoken command, treated him with a cool, professional distance. He was a water sitter, a low-tipping liability occupying a table that could be turned for hundreds of dollars. But Clara, an artist at heart, saw details others missed. She saw the way his long, elegant fingers, though spotted with age, trembled slightly when he lifted his cup. She noticed the faint scent of cedar and old books that clung to his coat. She saw the profound, almost unbearable loneliness in his gaze as he watched families celebrating birthdays, a look she recognized from the mirror on her grandmother's difficult days. He reminded her of the subjects of the portraits she sketched in her worn notebook during her breaks, faces that told stories of lives lived, of love and loss. Her grandmother, a retired librarian who had raised her on stories and quiet observation, had taught her to read people, to find the narrative beneath the surface. She began with small gestures of defiance. She'd bring him 2 lemon wedges instead of 1. When refilling his water, she'd ask, "Is the temperature to your liking, sir?" He would respond with a quiet, almost startled, "Thank you," his voice a dry rustle of leaves. One evening, she noticed him subtly trying to read the headlines of a newspaper left at an adjacent table. On her next pass, she folded the paper neatly and placed it beside his water pot. "The previous guest left this, sir. I thought you might enjoy it." He looked up at her, and the gratitude in his eyes was so potent it felt like a physical warmth. It became their silent pact. Julian Croft noticed, of course. He cornered her by the wine cellar one evening, his voice a venomous whisper that didn't carry into the dining room. "Thompson, your job is to sell the Chateau Neuf du Pape, not to run a reading room for vagrants. He's nursing a $2 beverage for 2 hours. He is a net loss. Cease the fraternization. Am I clear?" "Yes, Mr. Croft," Clara had murmured, her jaw tight. But she didn't stop. Her small kindnesses were a quiet rebellion, a defense of her own humanity against the cold, transactional nature of her job. It was the one part of her shift that didn't feel like a performance. She needed that feeling, that small spark of genuine connection, as much as she needed the paycheck that kept her and her grandmother from ruin. The last Tuesday in November descended on the city with a brutal Arctic fury. A freezing rain, driven by a wind that howled like a hungry wolf, slicked the streets with a treacherous glaze of ice. The grand windows of the gilded lantern rattled in their frames, and even the roaring fireplace seemed to struggle against the invasive cold. Clara, whose bus had been delayed for 40 minutes, arrived chilled to the bone, her cheap coat offering little protection against the elements. The evening was a nightmare. The weather had made the wealthy patrons irritable and demanding. Julian was a storm cloud of menacing energy, stalking the dining room, his critiques sharper and more public than usual. Thompson, Table 7's steaks were delivered 30 seconds late. "Do you understand the concept of momentum?" he hissed as she passed. It was nearly 9 o'clock when the old man arrived. He looked utterly ravaged by the storm. His tweed blazer was soaked through, clinging to his skeletal frame. He was shivering, not with a tremor, but with violent, uncontrollable spasms that shook his entire body. His face was a ghastly shade of grey, and his lips had a bluish tint. He stumbled to his usual table and collapsed into the chair, his breathing shallow and ragged. Clara watched him from across the room, a knot of genuine fear tightening in her chest. He didn't just look cold, he looked terribly ill. He fumbled with the buttons of his blazer, his numb fingers failing him. He was trying to warm himself, but it was a futile effort in the drafty corner. The dining room was thinning out. Julian was schmoozing a wealthy regular at the bar, his back to the corner. The other staff were busy with their closing duties. Clara felt a powerful, non-negotiable impulse. Policy, profit, Julian's wrath, it all dissolved, replaced by a fundamental human imperative. She went to the kitchen pass. The chef, a gruff but decent man named Miguel, had a large pot of his signature roasted tomato and fennel soup simmering on a back burner, reserved for staff meals at the end of the night. "Miguel," Clara said, her voice low. "Could I have a small bowl of that? For me. I'm freezing." Miguel grunted, ladling a generous portion into a warm ceramic bowl without looking up. "Don't let Croft see you eating on the floor." Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. This was infinitely more dangerous than free lemon wedges. This was inventory. This was theft. But she couldn't stop herself. She placed the steaming bowl on a small tray with a linen napkin and a silver spoon. She walked out of the kitchen, her movements swift and purposeful. She approached the corner table, her body shielding the tray from the bar. "Sir," she whispered. The old man's head lolled up. His eyes were glassy and unfocused. She placed the bowl in front of him. The rich, herbaceous aroma rose in a cloud of steam. "Please," she said, her voice urgent and soft. "You need to eat something warm. It's from the kitchen. On the house." He stared at the soup as if it were an apparition. Then his gaze lifted to her face. A storm of emotions flickered in his eyes. Confusion, disbelief, and then a wave of gratitude, so profound it was heartbreaking. His shaking hands reached for the spoon, but he could barely hold it. He fumbled, clattering it against the bowl. Gently, Clara picked up the spoon. "Here," she said quietly, her training as a caregiver for her grandmother taking over. "Let me." She scooped a small amount of soup and held it to his lips. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, then parted them. He swallowed, a visible warmth seeming to spread through his chest. He managed a weak nod. She gave him another spoonful, and then another. It was a moment of profound intimacy and vulnerability, a quiet act of care in a room built on performance and wealth. "Just what in the unholy hell do you think you are doing?" The voice was a whip crack, cold and sharp, slicing through the dining room's quiet hum. Julian Croft stood 5 feet away, his face a mask of apoplectic rage. The wealthy patron at the bar turned to stare. Every server froze. The moment of quiet grace was shattered. "Mr. Croft, he was—" Clara stammered, rising to her feet, the spoon still in her hand. "Do not speak," Julian snarled, his voice dangerously low as he closed the distance between them. "Did you create a guest check for that menu item, Thompson?" "No, but it was for the staff meal. It wasn't for service. So you admit to stealing it." It wasn't a question, it was a verdict. You stole restaurant property, you stole it, and you are now hand-feeding it to a non-paying vagrant like he's a potentate, and you're his personal servant. He gestured dismissively at the old man, who now stared at the scene with wide, horrified eyes, a drop of red soup on his pale chin. "I didn't steal anything," Clara said, her fear giving way to a surge of protective anger. He was freezing. He looked sick. It was the right thing to do. "The right thing?" Julian's laugh was a dry, ugly sound. "The right thing is to protect the restaurant's assets and its reputation, neither of which are enhanced by running a soup kitchen for street people. I have warned you about this. I have given you a direct order." His eyes narrowed, and a cruel, triumphant glint appeared within them. He seemed to savor this, the absolute power he wielded. He straightened up, and his voice boomed, projecting across the silent room for maximum effect. "Clara May Thompson," he announced, as if he were a town crier declaring a traitor. "In light of your theft of company property, gross insubordination, and flagrant disregard for restaurant policy, your employment with the Gilded Lantern is terminated, effective immediately. Collect your belongings. You have 2 minutes to exit the premises before I have you removed for trespassing." The word struck her with the force of a physical blow. Terminated. Just like that. The stares of her co-workers and the remaining patrons felt like tiny needles on her skin. She saw the shock on Miguel's face in the kitchen window. In the corner, the old man looked utterly stricken, as if he himself had delivered the wound. Humiliation, hot and suffocating, washed over her. Her mind spun in a panicked vortex. Rent, Grandma's prescriptions, the tuition payment due next month. "Julian, please," she whispered, the fight draining out of her. "You can't." "I can and I have," he said, a smug smirk twisting his lips. "Your final paycheck, less the cost of the stolen soup, will be mailed to you. Now get out of my restaurant." He turned his back on her, a final, contemptuous dismissal. Numbly, Clara walked to the small staff locker room, her body moving on autopilot. She grabbed her worn coat and her purse, which held her sketchbook and exactly $17. She refused to cry. She would not give him that satisfaction. She walked back through the dining room, her head held high, avoiding the pitying or curious glances. As she reached the grand, heavy doors, her eyes were drawn one last time to the corner table. The old man was struggling to his feet, his face a mask of anguish and distress. He took a shaky step towards her, one hand outstretched, his mouth open as if to speak, to protest. Clara gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of her head. It wasn't his fault. And then, just before she pushed the door open, a lifetime of observing details, of seeing the narratives others missed, coalesced into a single, defiant act. Her gaze flickered from the old man's distressed face to Julian, who was now preening at the bar, accepting a sympathetic handshake from the wealthy patron. She thought of the countless times she'd seen Julian disappear into the wine cellar with a specific, expensive-looking corkscrew, only to emerge minutes later with a bottle for a VIP table, always handling the transaction himself. She recalled the faint scent of cheap, sugary wine she'd once smelled on a supposedly vintage bottle she'd cleared. The pieces clicked into place. She leaned back slightly toward the old man, who had frozen at her gesture. Her voice was a bare whisper, meant only for him. "Thank you for letting me help you, sir," she said, her words a strange mix of formal politeness and coded warning. "And a piece of advice, if you ever return. Be wary of the vintage Bordeaux, especially the 82. Sometimes the label is worth more than what's inside the bottle." Then she turned, pushed open the heavy oak door, and stepped out into the merciless, freezing rain. The bell above the door chimed softly behind her, a funeral dirge for the life she had just lost. The icy rain was a brutal slap, a shock that jolted Clara from her numb state of disbelief. In an instant, her thin coat was soaked, and the biting wind seemed to pierce straight through to her bones. One moment, she was inside, in the gilded warmth of the restaurant. The next, she was an outcast on a dark, wet street, jobless and invisible. The long bus ride home was a blur of smeared city lights and the rhythmic thud of the windshield wipers, each sweep a tick of a clock counting down to her financial ruin. The words echoed in her mind, a cruel, looping soundtrack. Terminated. Theft. Get out. Theft. He had branded her a thief for a bowl of soup that was destined for the staff, soup that would have cost the restaurant pennies. The injustice of it was a bitter pill in her throat, but the consequences were terrifyingly real. A cold, dense knot of panic was forming in her stomach, heavy as a stone. Her mind, usually so clear and observant, was a chaotic storm of numbers and deadlines. The rent on their tiny, drafty apartment was due in 5 days, $975. Her grandmother's new heart medication, the one the insurance barely covered, was $220. The next installment of her tuition was over $1,000. She had about $300 in her checking account. The final paycheck Julian had mentioned would be meager, and who knew when he would deign to mail it. Every passing car, every warm, glowing window of a brownstone felt like a personal insult. People were inside, safe and dry, living their lives, while hers had just been systematically dismantled by a petty tyrant over an act of basic human decency. Was that what this was about? The soup? Or was it something more? She replayed the scene, her analyst's mind sifting through the details. It wasn't just the soup. It was her defiance. She had operated on a moral code that superseded Julian's rulebook. In his world of rigid hierarchy and transactional relationships, Her spontaneous act of compassion was a form of anarchy. She had shown allegiance to a fellow human being, a loyalty Julian demanded be reserved for the restaurant and its bottom line. By the time she trudged up the 3 flights of stairs to her apartment, she was shivering so badly she could barely fit the key in the lock. Her grandmother, Eleanor, was sitting in her favorite armchair, a thick Afghan over her lap, a book resting in her hands. Eleanor was a woman of quiet strength, her body made frail by a failing heart, but her mind as sharp as the day she'd retired from the city library. "Clara, my dear, you're home," Eleanor said, her voice soft. Then she saw her granddaughter's face, pale and rain-streaked, and the book slid from her lap. "Good heavens, child, what happened? You look as if you've seen a ghost." Clara's carefully constructed composure crumbled. She collapsed onto the worn rug at her grandmother's feet, the story pouring out of her in a torrent of tears and ragged breaths. The old man, the cold, the soup, Julian's cruel, public dismissal. Eleanor listened patiently, her hand stroking Clara's wet hair. She didn't offer platitudes or easy reassurances. When Clara was finished, the old woman was silent for a long moment, her gaze distant. "A man's character," she finally said, her voice raspy but firm, "is not defined by the walls he builds, but by the doors he opens for others. You opened a door tonight, Clara. You have nothing to be ashamed of." Later, after a hot shower that did little to warm the chill deep inside her, Clara sat at their small kitchen table, the stack of unpaid bills a testament to her failure. The panic was no longer a knot. It was a living entity, its icy claws wrapped tight around her lungs. She opened her laptop, the screen's harsh light illuminating her tired face. Job search, waitress, hostess, barista, retail. Each listing felt like a step down, a move further away from her dream of finishing her degree, of working in a museum, of a life surrounded by the art and history she loved. The application forms were a fresh hell. Reason for leaving previous employment? She typed and deleted a dozen answers. Terminated for insubordination. Disagreement with management. Company restructuring. They all sounded like lies or admissions of guilt. Julian's accusation, as baseless as it was a poison that would taint her professional life, a black mark she would have to explain over and over. Hours bled into one another. The rain finally stopped, leaving behind a city cloaked in an eerie, dripping silence. Clara felt utterly, profoundly alone. She had always been the strong one, the one who handled things, the one who reassured her grandmother that everything would be all right. But tonight, she felt like a child, lost and terrified. She thought of the old man. She hoped he was warm. She hoped the soup had helped. And then, a bitter, resentful thought surfaced. Why him? Why did her entire world have to detonate over a stranger? He would go on with his life, unaware of the wreckage he'd left in his wake. It wasn't his fault, she knew that, logically. The fault lay with Julian. But in the dark, desperate hours of the night, anger was an easier emotion to bear than abject fear. She finally shut the laptop, having sent out 17 applications into the digital abyss. She tiptoed into her grandmother's room. Eleanor was asleep, her breathing shallow but steady. Clara adjusted the Afghan, her heart aching with a fierce, protective love. "I'll fix this, Grandma," she whispered into the darkness. "I promise." But as she crawled into her own cold bed, the promise felt like a fragile, hollow thing, a lie she was telling to the only person in the world who depended on her completely. Sleep was a distant shore she couldn't reach. She just lay there, staring at the water stains on the ceiling, listening to the slow drip of a leaky pipe, each drop a second lost, a step closer to a future she could not bear to face. The next morning dawned cold and grey, the sky the colour of dishwater. A sleepless night had left Clara feeling hollowed out, her anxiety a constant, low-grade hum beneath her skin. She went through the motions, making tea, helping her grandmother with her morning pills, pretending to eat a piece of toast, all while a silent scream echoed in her mind. She returned to the laptop, the grim reality of her situation pressing down on her. The cycle of searching and applying began again, each rejection email that was already trickling in. Polite, automated brush-offs, chipping away at her resolve. The question of her dismissal felt like an insurmountable barrier. How could she explain an act of compassion in a way that didn't sound like a naive disregard for rules? Around 10:30, a sound from the street below broke her concentration. It was a deep, throaty purr, the sound of a powerful engine, utterly alien to the usual symphony of sputtering sedans and rattling delivery trucks on their modest block. She peered through the grimy window pane, and her breath hitched. Parked directly in front of their building, taking up 2 spots, was a car that didn't belong in her world. It was a Bentley, long and black and polished to a liquid shine. Its windows were tinted to an impenetrable darkness, reflecting the bleak sky like black mirrors. It was so profoundly out of place, it felt like a hallucination. A few neighbors were already staring from their windows, their curiosity piqued. Clara's first thought was a panicked one, a high-end collections agency. Had one of the medical bills gone that far? It seemed impossible, but her mind, already primed for disaster, leaped to the worst conclusion. She watched, frozen, as the driver's side door opened. A man in a chauffeur's uniform got out and walked around to open the rear passenger door. A different man emerged. He was perhaps in his late 40s, tall and lean, dressed in a charcoal grey suit, so perfectly tailored it seemed moulded to him. He carried a slim leather briefcase and moved with an air of quiet, unhurried confidence. He looked up, his gaze sweeping the weathered facade of her building, and for a heart-stopping moment, his eyes seemed to lock directly onto her window. Clara jerked back, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Seconds later, a firm, decisive knock echoed from her apartment door. It wasn't the familiar tap of a neighbor. It was the sound of purpose, of someone who did not expect to be kept waiting. She stood paralyzed in the middle of her small living room. Who could it be? What could they want? She thought about ignoring it, about pretending she wasn't home. But the knock came again, louder this time, more insistent. Taking a shaky breath, she crept to the door and looked through the peephole. The fisheye lens showed the man in the suit, his expression neutral and patient. He wasn't going away. With a trembling hand, she slid the chain lock into place and opened the door a few inches. "Can I help you?" Her voice was a reedy whisper. The man's expression was professional, not threatening. "Miss Clara May Thompson?" he asked, his voice smooth and modulated. "Yes?" "My name is Marcus Thorne. I'm an attorney." He held up a business card through the crack. The lettering was elegantly embossed on thick, creamy cardstock. "I represent a client who has asked me to speak with you. May I come in?" An attorney. The word sent a fresh wave of ice through Clara's veins. Was Julian suing her? For slander? For the cost of the soup? It was insane, but no more insane than getting fired for it in the first place. I don't understand. I can't afford a lawyer. I haven't done anything wrong." "You are in no trouble, Miss Thompson, I assure you," Mr. Thorne said calmly, his eyes betraying a hint of sympathy. "Quite the contrary. My client has a proposition for you. It concerns the events of last night at the Gilded Lantern." Clara stared at him, her mind struggling to process his words. A proposition? The only person she'd interacted with besides Julian was the old man. But it was impossible. A man who couldn't afford a meal, couldn't possibly have a lawyer who wore a $4,000 suit and arrived in a Bentley. "I'm sorry, I'm very confused," she stammered. "I understand," the lawyer replied with practiced patience. "It would be far simpler to explain if you would agree to accompany me. My client wishes to meet with you. He is waiting." "Accompany you where?" she asked, her suspicion mounting. "Back to the Gilded Lantern," he said. The suggestion was so preposterous, so utterly absurd, that Clara almost laughed. Go back to the scene of her deepest humiliation, the place she had been cast out of less than 24 hours ago. No, absolutely not. Why on earth would I go back there? "Because, Miss Thompson," Mr. Thorne said, his gaze steady and serious, "my client believes a profound injustice was committed, and he is in a position to see it rectified. My client is the old man you helped last night. His name is Alistair Blackwood." The name hung in the air. Alistair Blackwood, the reclusive, legendary founder of Blackwood Capital, a man rumoured to be one of the wealthiest and most private figures in the country, a man whose face hadn't been publicly photographed in over a decade. It couldn't be. "That's impossible," Clara whispered. "He has spent the last year unencumbered by the usual trappings of his life," Mr. Thorne explained carefully. "He was deeply impressed by your character, not just your kindness, but by your final words to him. The warning about the wine. It confirmed a suspicion he has held for some time about the restaurant's management." Clara's mind reeled, her whispered warning. It wasn't just a parting shot of defiance, it was a key. "Mr. Blackwood is a very determined man," Thorne continued. "He is waiting at the restaurant now. We will be in the car for 15 minutes. If you decide to join us, we can address this situation today. If not, I will respect your decision, but you may be forgoing a significant opportunity to see justice done." He slid his business card through the crack in the door. It landed on the worn linoleum floor. With a polite nod, he turned and walked away. Clara watched through the peephole as he descended the stairs and was let into the waiting Bentley. She was left alone in the silent hallway, her mind a maelstrom of fear, disbelief, and a tiny, dangerous flicker of hope. Every self-preservation instinct told her to lock the door and forget this ever happened. It was a prank, a scam, a cruel joke. But then she looked at the expensive card on her floor. She looked at the bills on her kitchen table. She thought of her grandmother sleeping peacefully in the other room. What was the worst that could happen? More humiliation? She was already at rock bottom. What if this was real? What if this was the one, impossible, 1,000,000-to-1 chance to climb back out? With a surge of desperate resolve, she unlatched the chain. She had 15 minutes to change her life. The ride back to La Tour, the Gilded Lantern, was a surreal journey through a city that suddenly looked different. The interior of the Bentley was a cocoon of silent luxury, smelling of supple leather and old money. Marcus Thorne sat opposite her, speaking quietly into his phone in a language of trusts and acquisitions that was entirely foreign to her. Clara simply stared out the window, her hands clenched in her lap, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. As they turned onto the familiar cobblestone street, she saw it. The Bentley didn't pull up to the curb. It glided to a stop behind a second identical black car parked directly in front of the restaurant's main entrance. Standing on the sidewalk were two other figures in dark suits, their presence an unmistakable sign that this was not a normal day. Mr. Thorne opened her door. "Mr. Blackwood is waiting for you inside, at his usual table," he said. "He asked that you come in first. We will follow in a moment." Walking toward those heavy oak doors was one of the hardest things Clara had ever done. Every fiber of her being screamed to turn and run. She took a deep breath, pushed the door open, and stepped inside. The bell chimed. The lunch service was in full swing. The restaurant was a hum of clinking silverware and hushed conversations. And then she saw him. Julian Croft was standing near the host stand, preening over a favorable review in a magazine with two of his senior waiters. He looked up as the bell chimed, an expression of annoyance on his face, which quickly morphed into a sneer of contemptuous rage when he saw Clara. "I believe I made myself explicitly clear," he began, stalking towards her. "You are trespassing. I am calling the police." He stopped dead. The front door opened again, and Marcus Thorne entered, followed by the two other men in suits. They moved with the silent, imposing efficiency of federal agents, flanking the doorway. Julian's face paled, his eyes darting between them and Clara, confusion warring with his anger. Clara's gaze, however, was fixed on the corner table. The old man was sitting there. Alistair Blackwood. He was still wearing the worn tweed blazer, but there was a new stillness about him, an aura of immense, coiled power. He met her eyes from across the room and gave a slow, deliberate nod. "What is the meaning of this?" Julian demanded, his voice a shaky imitation of his usual authority. "Mr. Croft," Marcus Thorne said, his voice calm but carrying the weight of absolute power. "My name is Marcus Thorne. I am chief counsel for Blackwood Capital, the primary owner of the hospitality group that holds a controlling interest in this restaurant chain." Julian's jaw worked, but no sound emerged. The color drained completely from his face, leaving it a sickly, mottled gray. He looked as if the floor had just vanished from beneath his feet. "Mr. Blackwood has been conducting a personal, long-term audit of this establishment," Thorne continued, his tone icy. "He has noted numerous discrepancies. But it was Miss Thompson's astute observation last night that provided the final piece of the puzzle." He gestured to one of the other men, who stepped forward and handed Julian a tablet. On the screen was a detailed report, shipping manifests, inventory logs, and bank records. "Our forensic accounting team has been busy overnight, Mr. Croft. We've found a consistent pattern. You sign for deliveries of premium vintage wines, the 82 Bordeaux, the 61 Latour. Yet our sources indicate you have a secondary supplier of significantly cheaper, rebottled wines delivered to your home address. It seems you've been swapping the inventory, charging our patrons for premier labels while serving them inferior products and pocketing the substantial difference. A fraud amounting to well over $250,000 over the past 3 years. Julian stared at the tablet, his hands shaking. The two waiters who had been fawning over him moments before took a noticeable step back, their faces masks of shock. This is a lie. It's a mistake," he stammered, looking wildly around the room, which had fallen deathly silent. Every patron was now watching the drama unfold. Alistair Blackwood rose slowly from his table. He walked across the room, his steps measured and deliberate. The worn blazer seemed to transform as he moved, becoming not a sign of poverty, but of a man so powerful he had no need for the trappings of wealth. He stopped directly in front of his now trembling manager. "The only mistake, Julian," Alistair said, his voice quiet yet resonating through the entire restaurant, "was believing that your cruelty was a sign of strength. It was merely a cover for your own petty thievery." He looked at the horrified patrons. "You have not only stolen from my company," he said, his voice rising with cold fury, "you have cheated and deceived every person who has walked through that door, trusting in the integrity of this establishment." He then turned his gaze to Clara, and the ice in his eyes melted, replaced by a profound respect. "This young woman," he said, his voice clear and unwavering, "showed more integrity in a single act of compassion, an act for which you fired her, than you have shown in your entire career. She gave a starving man a bowl of soup. You sold lies in a bottle." He turned back to Julian. "Your employment is terminated. These gentlemen will escort you from the building. You will be met outside by detectives from the fraud division. I suggest you cooperate fully." Julian Croft looked at Clara, his eyes filled with a venomous, pleading hatred. He had been a king in this castle, and in a single morning, the girl he had crushed under his heel had been the agent of his spectacular ruin, hung in the air, a palpable ghost. The silence that followed Julian Croft's removal was not empty. It was a vacuum, pulling the sound and breath from the room. Every clink of silver, every nervous cough, was amplified into a declaration. Clara stood rooted to the Persian rug, the stares of the remaining patrons and her former colleagues feeling like 1,000 tiny weights pressing down on her skin. She was the epicenter of a cataclysm she hadn't intended to create, a quiet girl who had somehow toppled a king. Alistair Blackwood turned from the now empty doorway, and the immense, coiled authority he had projected seemed to retract, folding back into the fragile frame she knew. He crossed the room, his scuffed brogues making no sound, and the journey of those 20 feet felt like the closing of an impossible distance between two worlds. He stopped before her, and for a moment he was just the man from the corner table again, his pale eyes holding a universe of weariness, gratitude, and something else, a profound, searching uncertainty. "Clara May Thompson," he said, his voice a low murmur that was somehow for her alone, despite the dozen pairs of ears straining to listen. "Are you all right?" The simple question, so mundane after the theatricality of the past 10 minutes, was what finally broke her paralysis. She could only manage a single, shaky nod, her throat too tight for words. "I imagine you have a great many questions," he continued, a faint, wry smile touching his lips. He gestured to his usual table, the small, undesirable one by the service entrance. "Would you do an old man one more kindness? Please, sit with me. The seat opposite me has been empty for a very long time." As if moving through water, she followed him. The other patrons watched, their filet mignons growing cold, as the billionaire in the frayed tweed blazer held a chair for the waitress he had just vindicated. Marcus Thorne and his associates maintained a silent, sentinel-like perimeter near the entrance, ensuring this strange, sacred space would not be disturbed. When they were seated, Alistair folded his hands on the table. They were steady now, the tremor she had so often noticed completely gone. He didn't speak immediately, instead gazing around the dining room at the mahogany walls and the gilded lanterns, as if seeing it all for the first time. "My wife Eleanor, she loved this place," he began, his voice soft, contemplative. "But she never cared for the main dining room. She called it the Peacock Gallery. She preferred this corner. She said you could feel the restaurant's true heartbeat back here, the quiet anxieties of the staff, the unguarded conversations, the real stories." He met Clara's gaze. "She was a librarian. She taught me how to read the narratives beneath the surface. I see you share the same gift." He paused, and the silence stretched, filled with the weight of his unspoken grief. "When she passed away last year, the world became muted, a symphony with all the high notes removed. My life, the company, The boardrooms, the endless calculus of wealth. It all felt like a machine I had built but no longer understood the purpose of. It ran on ambition and profit, but its soul had vanished. Because she had been its soul. He leaned forward slightly, his eyes boring into hers, not with the intensity of a CEO, but with the raw vulnerability of a man confessing a deep and terrible truth. So I began a pilgrimage. I shed the skin of Alistair Blackwood, CEO, and tried to find the world as she saw it. I came here, to her table, searching for a sign that the kindness and decency she championed weren't just a fairy tale we told ourselves. For months, I found nothing. I was invisible, a ghost at the feast. People looked through me. They saw a liability, a water sitter, a net loss. He gestured vaguely towards where Julian had stood. Men like Croft, they are the logical endpoint of the world I built. A world where human worth is a number on a balance sheet. He was a symptom of a disease I myself had nurtured, and I was beginning to believe the disease was terminal. I was beginning to believe Eleanor had been wrong. His voice cracked just for a moment. And then you brought me a second lemon wedge. Clara stared at him, the absurdity and the profundity of it hitting her all at once. It was nothing, she whispered. It was everything, he countered, his voice regaining its strength. It was an act with no expectation of reward. It was a crack of light in a very dark room. Last night, you didn't just give me a bowl of soup, Clara. You gave me a reason to fight the cynicism that was consuming me whole. You showed me that my wife's world, her belief in the quiet power of human dignity, was not dead. It was right here, in this corner, embodied by a young art student who refused to let her own humanity be extinguished by a cruel and transactional world. The weight of his words settled upon her. This wasn't just about a job. This was about a man's soul, about a legacy, about the entire meaning of a life's work. She had been a participant in a story far grander and more personal than she could have ever imagined. Which brings us to the present, he said, shifting his tone. It became more focused, the strategist emerging from the grieving husband. I could offer you your job back, with a promotion and a raise. I could write you a check that would solve all your financial problems. But that would be an insult. It would be charity. And what you did was not an act of charity. It was an act of profound moral clarity. Charity is giving a man a fish. Clarity is seeing that the whole damn lake is poisoned. He leaned back. Julian Croft is gone. But the system that created him remains. My company, Blackwood Capital, owns dozens of establishments like this one. Hotels, resorts, restaurants, and I have no doubt they are filled with other Julian Crofts and other Clara Thompsons. The problem is, my entire executive team is trained to see the Crofts. They speak the language of efficiency and profit margins. They are blind to the Claras. They don't have a metric for measuring decency. He looked at her, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of helplessness in the powerful man's eyes. I don't want to offer you a job, Clara. I want to offer you a partnership. I have a company with a soul sickness, and I don't know how to cure it. I need a new kind of consultant, a new kind of artist, someone who can teach us how to see again. The air left her lungs. A partnership? Her. Mr. Blackwood, Alistair, I don't know anything about business. I'm an art history student. I sketch people on my breaks. I organize my grandmother's pills. I wouldn't even know where to begin. You would begin exactly where you always have, he said firmly. By observing. By seeing the details others miss. I don't want you to learn how to read a spreadsheet. I have 1,000 people who can do that. I want you to teach my people how to read a room. I want you to travel to my properties, to sit in the corners, to talk to the staff, to identify the gardeners who love their flowers and the managers who poison their teams. I want you to help me build a new corporate metric, one based not on profit, but on dignity. He saw the fear and disbelief warring on her face. This isn't a demotion for you, he said, addressing her unspoken fear. You will be a senior advisor. You will report only to me. We will create a foundation in your grandmother's name, the Eleanor Thompson Foundation for Compassionate Service, and you will be its director. We will fund your education in any field you choose for the rest of your life. We will ensure your grandmother receives the finest medical care imaginable. This is not a reward for your kindness, Clara. It is a retainer for your character. I am hiring you for your soul. She thought of the cold rain. She thought of the $17 in her purse. She thought of the suffocating panic in the dead of night. And she thought of her grandmother's words. You opened a door tonight, Clara. She hadn't known it was a door to a whole new universe. Tears, hot and silent, began to trace paths down her cheeks. They weren't tears of relief or shock, but of a deeper, more complex emotion. The overwhelming feeling of being truly seen, of having the very essence of her character, the part of her she had nurtured in secret against the world's indifference, suddenly declared as the most valuable asset in the room. Why me? She finally managed to ask, her voice thick. Alistair's expression softened into one of infinite tenderness. Because Eleanor would have adored you, he said simply, and because in a world of gilded lanterns, you were the only one who seemed to understand that the true light doesn't come from the fixture, but from the flame within. He extended a hand across the table. It was not the hand of a billionaire offering a contract, but of a fellow traveler asking for directions. Slowly, Clara reached out and took it. Her hand was small and trembling. His was large and steady. It was a pact, a beginning. Weeks later, the city was draped in the soft, forgiving light of early spring. Clara stood by the large bay window of a new apartment, one where the only sound was the gentle rustle of leaves from the park below. The scent of beeswax and seared steak had been replaced by that of old books and lavender tea. Her grandmother was settled in a plush armchair, a cashmere throw over her lap. She wasn't just reading. She was immersed, a peaceful smile on her face. For the first time in years, the shadow of an unpaid medical bill or a looming eviction notice did not haunt the corners of their home. The absence of fear, Clara was discovering, was a palpable presence. It was a warmth that settled deep in your bones, a quiet hum of security that allowed the soul to finally unclench. Her new life was a strange and dizzying landscape. There were contracts and meetings, introductions to people whose names she had only ever seen in financial journals. But Alistair had been true to his word. He shielded her from the corporate machinery, positioning her not as an employee, but as an oracle. Her first official act had been to work with Marcus Thorne to rewrite the employee termination policy for the entire hospitality group. Now, any dismissal for non-criminal cause required a review by a 3-person panel, which included a peer elected by the staff. She had, in effect, abolished the absolute monarchy of petty tyrants like Julian Croft. Her art history degree was now fully funded, her tuition paid in a single wire transfer. But she found her perspective shifting. She looked at a Goya portrait, not just as a study of light and shadow, but as a masterclass in capturing the subject's hidden character. The flicker of fear in a king's eyes, the resilience in a peasant's jaw. Her art was no longer an escape from her life. It was the very lens through which she now navigated it. She sat at a small, elegant desk by the window and opened her sketchbook. For a long time after that night, she hadn't been able to draw. Her hands had felt clumsy, her subjects mundane compared to the drama she had lived. But now, inspiration was returning. She didn't sketch Alistair's powerful face or Julian's sneer. She drew her grandmother's hands, the delicate paper-thin skin and the blue rivers of veins resting peacefully on the open page of a book. She drew the way the morning light caught the dust motes dancing in the air, each one a tiny, insignificant speck that, when gathered together, created the very atmosphere of peace. Her phone buzzed. It was a message from Alistair. "Leaving for the Chicago property tomorrow. Let me know when you're ready for your first field study. No rush. The cure for a sickness of the soul requires patience." Clara smiled. She picked up her pen, and, beneath the sketch of her grandmother's hands, she began to write. It wasn't a report or a memo. It was a story. It was the story of a concierge at the Gilded Lantern named Maria, who always kept a small sewing kit in her pocket and had once, on a rainy Tuesday, mended the frayed cuff of an old man's tweed blazer while he wasn't looking, a small, invisible act of care. She was starting where she always had. With the details, she was no longer just an observer of stories. She was their curator, their champion. Her new title, she decided, was not director or advisor. She was a curator of dignity, and her work, the masterpiece of her life, had only just begun.